Hi guys, Olive here today to bring you part 2 of my summer book haul in which I would like to show you all of the nonfiction books that I have acquired recently. In the past, I've done quite a few different nonfiction book hauls, but I must say, I think this is the best collection of nonfiction books that I've ever hauled at one time. So let's get started talking about the books. Since I currently have language on the brain, since one of the books that I'm currently reading is all about language, I would first like to show you They Have a Word for It, a lighthearted lexicon of untranslatable words and phrases by Howard Rheingold. In this book, we learn some words from all different corners of the globe for which there is no translatable equivalent in any other language. As I said, I do really have language on the brain right now, and this does seem like a really charming book. Now moving on to some books about science, the first book I would like to show you is She Has Her Mother's Laugh, The Powers, Perversions, and Potential of Heredity by Carl Zimmer. There is much more to heredity than the average person may realize, and from what I read about this book, it seems as though the author takes a broad view and focuses on both biological as well as cultural inheritance. The next science book that I picked up is called Bonk, The Curious Coupling of Science and Sex by Mary Roach. The title of this one is pretty self-explanatory, but this is a book all about the studies that have been done about sex, and it was written by very well-known nonfiction writer Mary Roach. I was not the biggest fan of her previous book, Gulp, but from what I hear, that book is not her strongest, so I hope that this book, in addition to the other books in her back catalog that I'd like to read, will help me become the Mary Roach fan that I so desperately want to be. The next book I'd like to show you is actually an ARC copy that I requested from the publisher, Greystone Books, that is called Diving for Seahorses, Exploring the Science and Secrets of Human Memory by Hilda and Ilva Osby. This is a book written by two sisters. One is a novelist, the other is a neuropsychologist, and they combined forces to write this exploration of how the human memory works. When I first heard about this book, I was extremely compelled by it, especially because it seems on the surface to have been designed especially for me. My favorite animal is a seahorse, which is obviously on the cover and part of the title. And also, I am fascinated by memory, if only because mine is so freakish. This is one that I am planning to read and also review closer to its release date in early October. And while we're on the topic of the human mind, I would also like to show you An Alchemy of Mind, The Marvel and Mystery of the Brain by Diane Ackerman. In addition to explaining memory, thought, emotion, dreams, and language acquisition, Ackerman reports on the latest discoveries in neuroscience and addresses such controversial subjects as the effects of trauma, nature versus nurture, and male versus female brains. I have another one of Diane Ackerman's books, A Natural History of the Senses, on my shelves, which I really need to read, but what else is new? And continuing on with this same subject matter, I also picked up Hallucinations by Oliver Sacks. It seems as though when people think about hallucinations, they most frequently associate them with mental illness, when in actuality they're most frequently tied to sensory deprivation, intoxication, illness, or injury. It also seems that some people seek to escape hallucinations, while others yearn to experience them. This is a cultural as well as scientific exploration of these phenomena. And by a strange coincidence, I actually ended up picking up 2 different books on hallucinations during the course of the last few months. The other one I picked up is called Muses, Madmen, and Prophets, Rethinking the History, Science, and Meaning of Auditory Hallucination by Daniel P. Smith. This is a book about the bewildering, bewitching, and ultimately very upsetting ability of the human mind, auditory hallucination. This is both a general history of that phenomenon as well as the author's own personal history to understand his father's lifelong battle with the voices he heard in his head. And the last book that I picked up that deals in some way with human psychology is called Happiness, A History by Darren M. McMahon. Often believed to be the highest human calling, happiness has meant very different things to different civilizations. In this book, the author argues that our modern view of happiness is directly linked to a dramatic revolution in human expectations that has been occurring since the 18th century. To prove his point, the author looks not only to history, but also to the arts, which I think is fascinating. Something that I know is directly tied to my happiness is wine, and I've picked up 3 different books on the substance. The first of those being The Accidental Connoisseur, An Irreverent Journey Through the Wine World by Lawrence Osborne. I think I remember someone recommending this book to me after I read and reviewed Cork Dork at the end of last year, which I did really enjoy, but from what I hear, This memoir about wine focuses more about the history of wine, as well as the modern culture that surrounds it. It also seems to have a very sarcastic and very humorous tone to it, which is right up my alley. The next book on wine is not a memoir, but a history about sparkling wine, and that is The Widow Clicquot, the story of a champagne empire and the woman who ruled it by Talar J. Mazzeo. After her husband's untimely death, the Widow Clicquot, aged only 27, took the reins of the fledgling wine business that she and her husband had run together while he was alive. She found that she had a head for business, and she not only turned her company into an empire, but she did it with style. And the last book on wine that I'd like to show you in this haul is called Bacchus and Me, Adventures in the Wine Cellar by Jay McInerney. In this book, novelist Jay McInerney takes on writing about wine, and the blurb claims that it is full of untraditional musings about wine and wine culture. I guess we'll see. To pair nicely with the books about wine, I thought I would also show you a book on cheese called Immortal Milk, Adventures in Cheese. This is a mix of travel writing as well as cheese analysis, examining cheeses that we know well as ones that we don't, explaining the process of how cheese comes to be, and questioning why we take as much comfort in cheese as we do. There is a big storm going on outside right now. It's raining sideways. The next book I picked up is called Bunk, The Rise of Hoaxes, Humbug, Plagiarists, Phonies, Post-Facts, and Fake News by Kevin Young. This book looks at the history of the hoax, the motivation of hackers, and most importantly, why the rest of us fall for their schemes. As someone who is desperately trying to cling to reality like a baby sloth, I'm very eager to read this. The next book that I'd like to talk to you about is Love Songs, A Hidden History by Ted Gioia. This book was written by music historian Ted Gioia, who also wrote the great book How to Listen to Jazz that I read and reviewed at the end of last year. Actually, I reviewed that book in the exact same video that I reviewed Cork Dork. So needless to say, I have very high hopes for this one. This book looks at the history of love songs from the fertility rites of ancient culture right up to the overly sexualized music videos on YouTube today. Speaking of love, this next book is all about my favorite TV show. That book is called All the Pieces Matter, The Inside Story of The Wire by Jonathan Abrams. This is the history behind the creation of the great TV show The Wire as told by the actors, writers, directors, and anyone else involved in the creation of the show. I read another book like this, an oral history behind the making of Clueless called As If. So as soon as I saw that this book was out there, I bought it immediately. I had to restrain myself from tearing into this book as soon as it arrived, but I knew that if I did that, then I would want to go back and rewatch the show for like the 5th time. And I really haven't had time to do that recently, but when I am in the mood and have time for a good rewatch, I'm going to be reading this at the same time. The next book I picked up is a very fun one called The Secret Lives of Color by Cassia St. Clair. This book tells the stories behind 75 different colors and simultaneously shows all the different colors on the edges of all the pages. If you've been around my channel for a while and have seen all my different looks over the years, then you probably know that I'm a big fan of color, both wearing it and taking it in. Moving on to the biography of a very colorful character, I also picked up Oscar Wilde by Richard Ellman. I am very interested to learn more about Oscar Wilde's life. I have read his novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, as well as a few of his plays, and every time I even think about the importance of being earnest, I want to reread it. So maybe I'll end up reading this biography at the same time that I'm reading one or more of his plays. Another book on history that I picked up, albeit a much darker one, is called The Butchering Art, Joseph Lister's Quest to Transform the Grisly World of Victorian Medicine by Lindsay Fitzharris. This book claims to reveal the shocking world of 19th century surgery, as well as how it was transformed by advances made in germ theory, as well as antiseptics between 1860 and 1875. It stars a Quaker surgeon named Joseph Lister, as well as his contemporaries, and shows how exactly they obtained their cadavers for study, which was not always legal or ethical. And on a similar note, I also picked up a true crime book called The City of Falling Angels by John Berendt. This book was written by the same author of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, which was one of the books on my 10 most popular books on my TBR list that I am planning to read later this year. Like Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, this is another true crime book, but this one takes place in 1996 in Venice, when there is a fire that destroys a historic opera house. Another nonfiction book that I've picked up recently is called All the Devils Are Here, The Hidden History of the Financial Crisis by Bethany McLean and Joe Nocera. This book attempts to identify all relevant actors in the most recent financial crisis. So of course it looks at the typical targets. It looks at Wall Street. It looks at legislators, regulators, subprime mortgage companies, and even home buyers. But who else shoulders the blame? And have we all pieced together the whole puzzle? As someone who works in the financial industry, I'm very excited to read this. I believe this next one is one that Steve Donahue has sent me recently, and that is called Tattered Banners, A Life in Imperial Russia by Paul Radzianko. This is an account of life in Imperial Russia in the early 20th century, written by someone who was actually born into the Russian aristocracy and who watched everything crumble around him, first due to World War I and then due to the revolutions. And another Russian history book that I have acquired recently is called The World on Fire, 1919 and the Battle with Bolshevism by Anthony Reid. For those of you who do not know, 1919 was smack dab in the middle of the Russian Civil War, which kicked off shortly after the revolutions in 1917. This is a book that looks at how the West got involved in the Russian Civil War, providing all different types of support to the White Army, hoping to squash communism in Russia before it fully took root. Another book that I picked up is A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. This is one that I had trouble classifying as to whether it was fiction or nonfiction, but I looked it up and it seems as though it is generally classified as nonfiction. This is a long essay by Virginia Woolf in which she argues that women need their own money and space to be able to create. This is a book that I've wanted to own for a very long time. Another book that was difficult to classify, but that I ended up calling nonfiction, is the Victorian Flower Dictionary. This book is meant to be a companion to The Language of Flowers by Vanessa Diffenbaugh. That novel is highly focused on all the Victorian meanings behind different flowers. So this book gives all those meanings and is accompanied by really pretty illustrations. I think it would be fun to have this book handy when I eventually do a reread of The Language of Flowers. Another book that I picked up that focuses on flowers is The Reason for Flowers. Their history, culture, biology, and how they change our lives by Stephen Buckman. As you may have guessed, this book is all about flowers, their function in nature, their use in human civilization through food, medicine, and perfume, as well as their importance in human culture. Another book that I picked up about the natural world is called Chrysalis, Maria Sibylla Merian and the Secrets of Metamorphosis by Kim Todd. This is the story of an artist and naturalist, far less well known than Darwin or Audubon, by the name of Maria Sibylla Merian, who at the age of 50 decided to go on a solo scientific expedition to the New World to study insect metamorphosis. I love stories about lady scientists, especially true ones. The next book that I'd like to show you is called A Naturalist at Large, The Best Essays of Bernd Heinrich. This was yet another gift in the mail from my friend Steve Donahue, because he knows how much I love nature writing. And as much as I want to love Bernd Heinrich, I did not click very well with his book Winterworld, which I read earlier this year, but I think reading some of this author's essays would make his work a lot more palatable. So I am genuinely looking forward to this. The next book I picked up has a Shakespeare-inspired name, and that is called The Naming of the Shrew, A Curious History of Latin Names by John Wright. This book seeks to unravel the mysteries behind the often inscrutable, sometimes nonsensical, and frequently unpronounceable Latin names that have been assigned to living things since the 18th century. Next up, I'd like to show you The Unseen City, The Majesty of Pigeons, The Discreet Charm of Snails, and Other Wonders of the Urban Wilderness by Nathaniel Johnson. This book is about the traces of nature that are found but often overlooked in urban spaces. From what I read about this book, it seems as though the author wants to help us see through the eyes of the creatures who live in our cities, which I think is a really cute and creative idea. I have 5 books left to talk to you about in this haul, and they all deal with birds in one way or another. The first of those is called The Evolution of Beauty by Richard Prum. This is one that I've heard many good things about. This book takes on the mystery of why certain animals choose mates that are beautiful to the point of being impractical. On the surface, this seems to contradict evolutionary theory, but in fact, Darwin had actually proposed another theory of aesthetic mate choice, and this book looks at that theory. I also picked up A Gathering of Birds, an anthology of the best ornithological prose. This is a collection of writings about birds written by 19 different nature writers, including Thoreau and Audubon. You know I couldn't resist this. Next, I picked up Birdsong, A Natural History by Dawn Stopp. This book asks 2 questions. Why do birds sing, and what does it mean? The penultimate book in this haul is a tiny one called Flights of Fancy, Birds in Myth, Legend, and Superstition by Peter Tate. This is just a little nightstand book, and I do have others like it, but I am very serious when I have said in the past that I want to own all of the bird books. And the final book in this haul will also round out all the books that I've picked up on birds, simply called The Bird, A Natural History of Who Birds Are, Where They Came From, and How They Live by Colin Tudge. I expect that this will be a comprehensive exploration of birds, and I hope that it will be very well explained by the subtitle. So those were all of the nonfiction books that I've picked up recently. It's been quite a few. I've been putting off doing this haul for a while. If you have read any of these books, if you've heard about any of them, or if you're now interested in reading them after hearing me talk about them, I would love to hear from you in the comment section below. Or if you want to chat with me somewhere other than YouTube, I am on a variety of different places on social media, and I will put the links to all of my profiles in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.